Have you ever found yourself at a real crossroads in life? Where the old strategies they just stop working.
Oh, absolutely. Maybe it was a career thing or a relationship ending, something that really shook you up.
Exactly. We all hit those moments, those times of, upheaval, where you just can't cling to the past anymore.
And if you can feel that personally, just try to imagine it scaled up. What happens when a whole nation hits that kind of critical point?
Yeah, when its traditions, its economy, maybe its whole identity just aren't enough to face whatever new reality is coming.
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is, and that's exactly the kind of deep dive we're getting into today. We're looking at the brilliant work of Jared Diamond, Pulitzer Prize winner, Guns, Germs, and Steel, Collapse.
Right. And this time it's his book, Upheaval, Turning Points for Nations in Crisis. He tackles this exact question head on.
So our mission today, really, is to unpack Diamond's framework. We want to pull out the most surprising insights, the valuable lessons from the histories he looks at.
Yeah, we want to get beyond just what happened. We want to understand why some nations manage to recover, why others struggle, and maybe, just maybe, what that tells us about our own world today and about you listening.
Okay, let's dig in. Diamond's idea of a crisis. It isn't just any old problem, is it? Or some slow, gradual change.
No, not at all. He calls it a turning point. It's a challenge so big, so fundamental, that it absolutely demands new ways of coping. The old ways just won't cut it anymore. They're inadequate.
It's more than a rough patch then. It's like a real moment of reckoning.
That's a good way to put it. And it's interesting, he mentions the Chinese character for crisis, Weiji. It's actually made of two parts. Wei, meaning danger,
Okay.
and ji, meaning opportunity. That duality, danger and opportunity, together, that's really central to how Diamond sees these moments.
That's fascinating, that duality. But, when a nation's actually in a crisis, do people really see the opportunity part then? Or is it just overwhelming danger until way later?
I think it's usually the latter. The opportunity often only really emerges in hindsight, after a lot of pain. Diamond uses some powerful personal stories to make this point.
Like what?
Well, take the Coconut Grove fire in Boston back in 1942, just catastrophic. It wasn't just the fire itself, it was the deep psychological trauma for everyone involved, survivors, families.
Mm-hmm.
People were crushed by guilt, grief. Some even took their own lives. Their world just shattered in an instant.
Ah, that's awful. Hard to even imagine coming back from something like that.
Exactly. But what Diamond highlights is how many of those people, after weeks of intense pain, they began this slow, really agonizing process. Grieving, yes, but also rethinking their values, rebuilding their lives.
Huh.
They became, as he puts it, mosaics, bits of the old self, bits of the new. And that tragedy actually transformed short-term psychotherapy. It showed the need for immediate, focused help in acute crises, a turning point for the field itself.
Wow. So the crisis forced a change, not just for individuals, but for how we help people.
Precisely. And Diamond shares a personal one, too, quite relatable. Back in 1959, he was a grad student, physiology. Felt like a total nobody.
Really? Jared Diamond?
Yeah. He'd always been top of his class. Suddenly he had no results, felt totally demoralized. He even read Thoreau's Walden, started questioning the whole scientific enterprise, thought about becoming a translator.
Wow. We've all been there, that kind of self-doubt.
Totally. And what helped him? His father told him, basically, just stick it out a little longer. Persist.
Good advice.
Crucial advice, it turns out. It led to his breakthrough on gallbladder research, discovering they transport ions without developing voltages, which was unheard of then. That wasn't just science. It was him resolving his own first major professional crisis.
So you see the parallels clearly. Personal upheaval, national upheaval. There's a similar dynamic.
That's Diamond's argument. He says the playbook for recovery, whether individual or national, has common elements. He lays out 12 factors that influence how these crises play out.
12 factors.
Yeah.
Okay. And these apply to both people and whole countries.
Yeah. Some translate very directly. Others work more like metaphors. But they give us a kind of common language to talk about these turning points, big or small.
Right. Let's maybe touch on a few. The first one sounds simple, but maybe it's not. Acknowledgement of crisis. Just admitting there is a problem.
Deceptively simple is right. Diamond argues this is often the hardest step, the one most avoided.
Why is that so difficult? Just admitting it.
Well, think about it. It's uncomfortable, right? Nobody wants to admit the ground is shaking under their feet. For nations, you might have powerful groups with vested interests in the status quo, or just a really strong national story that makes it hard to see the problem.
Like denying climate change.
Exactly, or economic decline. Until you acknowledge it honestly, you can't really start fixing it.
Okay, makes sense. Then comes acceptance of responsibility, not just blaming someone else.
Precisely. Moving from being a victim to being an agent of change. Then there's building a fence, or what he calls selective change.
Building a fence, what does that mean?
It's about figuring out what's actually working fine and needs protecting, that's the fence, versus what's broken and needs to be changed or thrown out entirely.
Ah, okay, so you don't just tear everything down.
Right, or cling blindly to everything. Nations do this when they reassess core values, keep some, discard others that are holding them back. It's about being discerning.
Got it. And help from others is on the list too. That seems pretty crucial.
Absolutely. Material held emotional support. Diamond mentions calling friends after his divorce. For nations, it could be foreign aid, alliances, that kind of thing.
Which connects to another factor, other people or nations as models. Learning from how others coped successfully.
Yeah, why reinvent the wheel if someone else has found a path through a similar crisis?
And then there are two that seem linked. Ego strength or national identity, and honest self-appraisal.
Deeply linked. Ego strength is that sense of self-worth for a person. For a nation, it's a strong shared identity, pride, common values. Think of Finland with its unique language. That gave them cohesion.
But that identity has to be paired with honesty, right?
Crucially, honest self-appraisal. That means really looking hard, often painfully, at your strengths and your weaknesses. No sugarcoating. You need that realistic view to make good decisions. Self-deception is fatal in a crisis.
Okay, so what else is in this toolkit?
Let's see. There's experience of previous crises learning from the past. Patience crises aren't solved overnight. Flexibility, being adaptable both personally and for nations, maybe situationally.
Situationally flexible.
Yeah, like post-war Germany made huge shifts, but maybe national flexibility isn't always across the board. It might depend on the type of challenge. Then core values the beliefs central to who you are. But clinging to the wrong core values can block resolution.
Right. And
There's freedom from constraints. This is about how much room you actually have to maneuver. Practical limits or geopolitical ones. Like you said, the U.S. has oceans.
well, Germany's right there in the middle of Europe with powerful neighbors.
Yeah.
Big difference in constraints.
Huge difference. So yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive list, a framework to analyze these moments.
It really is. A powerful lens. Okay, let's use it. Let's look at some of these historical examples Diamond digs into, starting with Finland. Talk about external pressure.
Well, Finland's story is incredible. A small nation, remember, only about 3.7 million people in 1939? And this unique language, not Indo-European, plus that very strong identity linked to the Kalevala, that identity was a key factor, that ego strength.
And they faced just an unbelievable shock. The Winter War, 1939-40. The Soviet Union attacks them. The population difference was something like 40-1.
Insane odds. But the Finns refused the initial Soviet demands. They'd seen what happened to Czechoslovakia. Appeasement didn't save them. So that was their stark acknowledgement of crisis. Giving in wasn't really an option they trusted.
And they fought back against those odds.
Unbelievably. They had zero chance of actually defeating Stalin, but they showed incredible defiance, incredible ingenuity, guerrilla tactics, Molotov cocktails named after the Soviet foreign minister, ironically soldiers on skis, a really decentralized army command that encouraged taking initiative. That's situation-specific flexibility in action.
And they actually hurt the Soviets.
Inflicted massive losses, maybe 500,000 Soviet soldiers killed or wounded. It was astonishing.
Wow. But they couldn't win outright. What was the outcome?
They kept their independence, which was the main goal. But the cost was immense. They lost Karelia, a big chunk of territory, had to resettle 420,000 people internally, a huge disruption.
And reparations too, right?
Heavy reparations, paid mostly through trade with the USSR, something like 20% of their trade. And they often had to take inferior Soviet goods, like those infamous Moskvich cars with apparently sun floors you had to push open.
Huh. So that's accepting responsibility for survival, even the painful parts.
Absolutely. And it led to this policy later called Finlandization. Basically, a very pragmatic foreign policy to keep the Soviets happy, avoid another conflict. Neutrality, letting the Soviets have bases, even trying their own leaders for war crimes demanded by Moscow.
That sounds controversial.
It was, especially outside Finland. But for them, it was selective change, making concessions, sometimes painful ones, to protect their absolute core value, independence. They knew they were mostly alone, not much help from others forthcoming, against the USSR.
So the surprising takeaway from Finland, maybe it's that Knowing your non-negotiable core value and then being utterly pragmatic about everything else can let even a small nation survive against giants.
I think that's exactly right, that hard-earned pragmatism. Now contrast that with Japan, a very different kind of crisis, a forced opening.
Right. They were famously isolated before 1853 under the Tokugawa shogunate. Very limited foreign contact, more self-sufficient than, say, Britain, even though both are islands.
Then bang, Commodore Perry and the U.S. Navy show up in 1853, forced Japan to open ports, led to what they called unequal treaties, foreigners exempt from local laws. Japan couldn't set its own tariffs.
And they saw what happened to China with the Opium Wars.
Exactly, deep fear of being carved up like China. That was their acknowledgement of crisis. The old ways weren't protecting them anymore.
So what do?
It triggered the Meiji Restoration in 1868, overthrew the shogun, brought the emperor back to real power, though there was civil war over it. And then came this intense period of selective change.
Selective westernization.
That's it. They sent the Iwakura mission abroad to study Western practices, using other nations as models.
And they picked and chose, right? British Navy.
German Army, German Constitution, American education system. But here's the clever part. They framed all this radical change not as copying foreigners, but as restoring ancient Japanese traditions.
How'd they manage that?
Well, the emperor's new constitution, based on Germany's, was presented as his timeless gift to the people. Very skillful use of national identity to make the change palatable.
Smart. And the result?
Rapid modernization. Japan became a major power, an imperial power. Annexed Hokkaido, the Ryukyu Islands fought wars with China, Russia, colonized Korea.
But there's a downside later.
A huge one. Diamond argues that later Japanese leaders lacked the honest self-appraisal of the Meiji reformers. They became overconfident, which led directly to the disaster of World War II.
And a tragic core value revealed in that war was that no surrender idea.
Yeah, the Battle of Tarawa is a brutal example. Almost 2,600 elite Japanese defenders, nearly all died, many by suicide, rather than surrender. It shows how a core value, even one seen as honorable within a culture, can be disastrously inflexible in certain contexts. It prevented a different kind of resolution.
And the geopolitical lesson from Japan. Even an island isn't truly isolated.
Pretty much. That freedom from constraints can vanish quickly in a connected world. Distant pressures can force dramatic change.
Okay, now let's switch gears. Chile and Indonesia. These were more about internal breakdown leading to dictatorship. Chile is surprising because it had this long democratic history, right? Seems stable.
Yeah, relatively homogenous, unified. But then came Salvador Allende, elected president in 1970, a moderate himself, but he pushed very radical, polarizing policies.
Like nationalizing copper.
Copper, other businesses, land reform. It split the country, alienated the military, and really worried the U.S. Remember the Cold War context, the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't long before. The U.S. was actively trying to stop leftist governments in Latin America. This internal division was the tinder for the crisis.
And it led to Pinochet's coup in 73.
A sudden, violent coup. Pinochet wasn't even the initial leader, kind of fell into it. And what followed was brutal. Torture, maybe 100,000 exiles, killings, a complete shattering of their democratic tradition.
But economically, he went in a totally different direction.
Implemented those free market policies, the Chicago Boys model, a real paradox.
How did they get back to democracy?
Eventually, with a no vote and a referendum in 1988, Pinochet had to step down. And what's interesting is the role of the exiles. Many went to Western Europe, saw social democracies work, and came back valuing compromise.
Learning from other models again.
Exactly. And the post-Pinochet governments took this path of cautious justice, gradual reconciliation. Later on, finding out about Pinochet's own corruption helped solidify the shift. It was a slow process of accepting responsibility and selective change back towards democracy.
Now, Indonesia, fourth biggest country population-wise, most populous Muslim nation. Huge place.
And incredibly diverse. The whole idea of Indonesia as one nation is relatively recent, really only solidified under Dutch colonial rule around 1910. Before that, just a vast collection of islands, languages, cultures.
What was their turning point?
1965. A really messy, failed coup attempt by some junior army officers and Communist Party figures. It failed, but the army, led by Suharto, used it as a pretext.
A pretext for what?
For a horrifying, orchestrated mass murder campaign against suspected communists, sympathizers, ethnic Chinese. Estimates are just staggering 500,000 to maybe 2 million people killed. Diamond stresses this wasn't spontaneous violence. It was a planned military purge to consolidate power and protect its economic interests.
Just chilling. And that brought Suharto to power.
Yes, he gradually sidelined the existing leader, Sukarno, and ruled for 33 years. Created a military-dominated state, rampant corruption. He argued Indonesians weren't ready for democracy, so democratic development was put on hold for decades.
But did anything positive come out of that long repressive period, according to Diamond?
Well, he argues that while the human cost was immense, Suharto did manage to hold the incredibly diverse country together, maintain national unity and a degree of religious tolerance. And he fostered a strong sense of Indonesian national identity, helped by the rapid spread of the Bahasa Indonesia language. The crisis, however brutal, kind of forged that identity.
But it delayed democratic learning.
Absolutely. Though post-Suharto, Indonesia has shown progress, things like improved airline safety, more accountability. So selective change is happening now.
Okay, let's move to Germany. Not one big bang, but maybe multiple crises or gradual challenges.
Yeah, Germany's story is different. Post-World War II, the devastation was almost total. Millions dead, cities flattened, lost a quarter of its territory, divided east and west. 10 million homeless refugees. Just unimaginable.
Yet, West Germany had the economic miracle.
Right. Helped hugely by help from others, the Marshall Plan from the U.S., plus a new currency, the Deutschmark, and those free market policies under Adenauer and Erhard. Smart selective change on the economic front.
But the bigger challenge maybe was dealing with the Nazi past. That must have been incredibly difficult.
Immense and painful. There was initial reluctance, denial even. Many former Nazis ended up back in government jobs early on.
So how do they confront it?
A key figure Diamond highlights is the prosecutor Fritz Bauer. He relentlessly pushed for trials, like the Auschwitz trials. His argument was powerful. No law can justify a crime against humanity. Individuals have to follow their own conscience. That was a profound national moment of honest self-appraisal.
And then the student revolts in 1968.
Another huge turning point. The post-war generation confronting their parents' generation about complicity. It got ugly, led to violence like the Baader-Meinhof gang. But Diamond calls it a successful failure. It forced society to change, reduced that old German authoritarianism, even though the revolt itself didn't achieve its radical goals. Another necessary, painful self-correction.
And politically, there are shifts too.
Yes. Things like the Spiegel affair in '62, a big fight over press freedom, and then Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik reaching out to East Germany and the Eastern Bloc, accepting the post-war borders, the lost lands. That took immense courage, a real shift based on honest self-appraisal and selective change in foreign policy. It paved the way for eventual reunification.
And Germany's location, that's always been a factor, hasn't it? Right in the middle of Europe.
Absolutely. Flat North European plain, lots of powerful neighbors, historically very vulnerable. That geopolitical constraint forces a certain kind of diplomacy, very different from the situation of the U.S., protected by oceans, constant factor.
Finally, Australia. Diamond calls its crisis a slow-motion one, about identity.
Yeah. It started as a British convict colony, identified very strongly as British, and had that explicit white Australia policy from 1901 designed to keep non-Europeans out, a very clear but narrow national identity.
What shook that identity?
Two big shocks, both involving Britain. First, the fall of Singapore in 1942. Britain surrendered to Japan, which felt like a massive betrayal by the mother country. Then Japan bombed Darwin on Australian soil.
Wow. That must have been terrifying.
It forced a huge rethink. Australia realized it couldn't rely solely on Britain for defense anymore. That led them to turn towards the U.S., the ANZ-US Treaty in 1951, a painful acknowledgement of crisis.
And second shock.
Britain joining the European Economic Community, the precursor to the EU, in 1973. This felt like an economic betrayal. Britain's focus shifted, hurting Australian exports that had relied on Commonwealth ties. The apron strings were cut militarily and economically.
So these shocks forced Australia to change.
Gradually, yes. The White Australia policy wasn't dismantled overnight. It happened bit by bit, allowing Japanese war brides in '49, dropping the ridiculous dictation test used to exclude non-whites in '58. Lots of small selective changes over decades.
Until Go Whitlam came along in '72.
Right. His government really accelerated things. A crash program, he called it. Officially ditched white Australia, lowered the voting age, invested in Aboriginal communities, pursued a more independent foreign policy.
So he drove the change.
Well, Whitlam himself said his reforms were mostly recognition of what has already happened. The ground had already shifted. His government provided the political acceptance of responsibility to formalize that new, emerging multi-ethnic identity.
But it's still evolving, right? The identity question.
Definitely. Still debating the flag with the Union Jack, whether the British monarch should be head of state. Should Gallipoli or the Kokoda Trail campaign against Japan be the defining national military story? It shows how long selective change in something as deep as national identity can take.
So the lesson from Australia, maybe it's that identity crises don't always happen with a bang. They can be these slow burns forced by external shocks, gradually pushing a nation to let go of old ideas and find a new self, even with resistance.
I think that's a great summary of it. A powerful, slow transformation.
Okay, so we've looked back. Now, Diamond brings it to the present and the future. He looks hard at the United States. And, on paper, the U.S. has incredible strengths.
Oh, undeniable. Economically, still the world's largest high GDP per capita. Militarily, completely dominant, those 10 nuclear aircraft carriers versus one for France, none for most others. It's staggering.
And geographically,
Yeah.
just blessed, really. Fertile land, waterways like the Mississippi, oceans on both sides, neighbors that aren't, immediate military threats. That gives enormous freedom from constraints, freedom of choice.
Compared to Germany, night and day.
Plus, the political system checks and balances, theoretically allows for broad debate. Federalism lets states be like laboratories, California trying right on red, Kansas cutting taxes, seeing what happens, civilian control of the military.
And the human capital aspect. Historically, high social mobility, though that's changing. Amazing innovation, Nobel Prizes, tech giants, and the huge contribution of immigrants. Didn't you say over a third of U.S. Nobel laureates were born elsewhere?
Yeah, something like that. Incredible influx of talent. So massive strengths. But Diamond sees serious trouble brewing. 4 big crises potentially undermining everything.
And the question is, do those strengths make the U.S. resilient, or do they breed complacency, make it harder to even acknowledge the crisis?
That's the fear, isn't it? So what's the first crisis he points to?
Political polarization, the breakdown of compromise. It's become so toxic. You see it everywhere. Constant filibusters, blocking appointments, inability to agree on basic facts, let alone solutions.
Why does he think it's gotten so bad? What are the drivers?
He points to a few things. One is the insane cost of campaigns. Now politicians become beholden to donors, often extreme ones. Another, maybe counterintuitive, is easy domestic air travel.
Air travel. How does that cause polarization?
Because politicians fly home every weekend. They don't live in D.C. together, socialize across party lines, build personal relationships like they used to. It makes compromise harder. Plus, gerrymandering creates super safe seats, rewarding extremism. And then there's the media environment, niche information, filter bubbles, social media algorithms just feeding you what you already believe makes honest self-appraisal really difficult.
Okay, polarization. What's number 2?
Voter turnout. It's shockingly low for a wealthy democracy, around 55% in presidential years. Compare that to Australia's 93%, where it's compulsory.
Why is it so low here?
Diamond mentions obstacles like restrictive voter ID laws, purges of voter rolls, making registration difficult, the sheer length and negativity of campaigns turning people off. Low turnout can erode the legitimacy of the whole system.
All right, third crisis.
Growing inequality and immobility. The gap between rich and poor keeps widening. And that American dream, the rags to riches story. Statistically, it's harder to achieve here now than in many other developed countries.
And the consequences.
Social unrest, for one. Diamond mentions the '92 LA riots as partly fueled by this. It creates insecurity even for the wealthy, and it's a long-term drag on the economy and national stability.
And the fourth crisis area.
Underinvestment in the future. Things like basic research and development, infrastructure, roads, bridges, grids, and especially education.
Education seems critical.
Hugely. Some states spend more locking people up than on higher education. U.S. students lag behind in international math and science scores. Teachers here are paid less relative to the national average than in almost any other major democracy. And opportunities are wildly unequal. Compare public schools in poor areas to elite private ones. Not like Finland, where public education is uniformly strong.
So what's Diamond's prognosis for the U.S., given the strengths but also these serious problems?
He's cautious. He worries there isn't even widespread acknowledgement of crisis. There's a strong tendency to blame others, immigrants, foreign countries, the other political party, rather than accept responsibility. Powerful interests block needed changes. And the U.S. seems resistant to learning from other nations as models, like ignoring Canada's successful immigration system.
It sounds like the advantages might actually be hindering the ability to fix the problems.
That seems to be his concern. And then, if the U.S. situation isn't sobering enough, he zooms out to the global scale for potentially existential threats facing all of us.
Yes, okay, lay them on us.
First, obviously, nuclear weapons. The risk is always there. Regional conflicts going nuclear India-Pakistan, maybe North Korea. Miscalculation between the big powers, US, Russia, China. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? Accidental war from faulty warnings. And the absolute worst case, nuclear winter. Plus, terrorism, dirty bombs, stolen materials, still a massive danger.
Right. Number 2.
Climate change. And he specific calls global warming a misnomer. It's complex climate change. Some places get colder, more extremes everywhere. Ocean acidification killing coral reefs, which are vital nurseries for fish stocks.
And it's hard because the effects lag behind the causes.
Exactly. It makes it hard to act urgently. And there's no quick fix. Geoengineering is incredibly risky, requires atmospheric testing we can't really do safely.
Third global threat.
Resource depletion. Running out of non-renewable stuff like oil and minerals, obviously, but also depleting renewable resources, forests, fisheries, fresh water, faster than they can regenerate. Overfishing is a classic example of the tragedy of the commons.
Where everyone acting selfishly ruins the shared resource for all.
Precisely. Happens with oceans, migratory species, the atmosphere.
And the fourth global crisis.
Global inequality. This links to resource use. Diamond uses the stark factor of 32. People in rich countries consume resources and produce waste at about 32 times the rate of people in the poorest countries.
32 times.
Yeah. This fuels immense frustration, anger, can lead to terrorism, drives uncontrollable migration. And think about it. If everyone in the developing world reached first world consumption levels, overall world consumption would jump 11-fold. The planet simply cannot sustain that.
So these global problems, the challenge is solving them without a world government, right?
Exactly. There's no global acknowledgement of crisis that everyone agrees on. No shared global identity or values, really. No global political body with real teeth. We can't get help from others from Mars. There are no other planets as models. The usual factors for crisis resolution are mostly missing at the global level. And there's very little margin for error.
It sounds pretty bleak on the global scale. Are there any hopeful signs?
There are some. He points to existing agreements, even between enemies. Like, apparently Israel and Lebanon cooperate on monitoring migratory birds, even while technically at war. Small things, but they show cooperation is possible.
Finding common ground.
Yeah. And realistically, maybe full global consensus isn't needed initially. A few key players, the US, China, India, the EU, Japan, account for most of the world's population, economy, and environmental impact. If they could agree and lead, maybe using things like trade pressure, carbon tariffs, they can nudge others along.
So leadership from the big players is crucial, requiring unprecedented global acceptance of responsibility.
That's the hope, however fragile.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together. We've journeyed through Diamond's framework, seen how nations, like individuals, navigate these intense turning points using a similar set of tools or fail when they don't use them well.
And history really does show this incredible capacity for recovery, for selective change, even after utter catastrophe, if the right factors align.
But it raises that question, Diamond asks. Is crisis necessary? Do nations need that shock, that coconut grove fire moment to really make fundamental changes?
Or can they do it proactively? Self-motivated transformation. It's a tough one. History suggests maybe both. But often it seems it takes that real pain to force the acknowledgement of crisis.
And the role of leaders in all this. Are they driving history or just reacting?
Diamond seems to think they can make a real difference, especially maybe authoritarian leaders or wartime leaders who have more freedom from constraints. But usually they're operating within limits. Their personal ego strength, their willingness for honest self-appraisal, that can be critical in choosing the right path among limited options.
So beyond the specific stories, history offers these broader themes, right? Small countries next to big aggressive ones are always in danger. Honest self-assessment is always vital.
These are the enduring lessons, yeah. They apply across time and place.
Which brings us right back to today. The challenges we face now, polarization here in the US, climate change globally, they feel enormous. But maybe the principles still apply. If we collectively can manage to acknowledge the problems, truly accept responsibility, practice honest self-appraisal, and figure out the right selective changes.
Recognizing what still serves us, what we absolutely must let go of.
Then maybe navigating these turning points is possible. So the question for you listening is maybe this. What specific selective changes in our own countries or in how the world works together will you be looking for as signs that we're actually learning these lessons and heading towards a better future?